Step away from the vehicle.
I'm loading my vehicle.
What are you doing?
I'm a sitting family court judge.
On a weekday afternoon in Atlanta, Georgia, a uniformed police officer observed a black male standing beside a parked vehicle with its trunk open. A stroller, child seat, and several personal items were visible inside the vehicle. A child was present at the scene. The officer initiated contact without a prior call for service, reported crime, or suspect description. Body-worn camera footage shows the officer exited the patrol vehicle and issued verbal instructions to the individual before stating a reason for the stop. The officer asked what the individual was doing. The individual responded that he was loading his vehicle. The officer requested identification. No explanation was provided for the request. The individual did not attempt to leave the location and complied with instructions. Dispatch records indicate no active alerts or incidents matching the individual's description in the immediate area. The officer continued the encounter and referenced suspicious behavior without specifying a statutory violation or observable offense. The interaction lasted approximately 15 minutes. During this time, the officer maintained physical positioning between the individual and the vehicle. The stroller remained unsecured in the trunk. The child remained nearby. At 12 minutes into the encounter, the individual stated a profession and identified himself as a sitting family court judge in Fulton County, Georgia. This information was not immediately acknowledged. The officer paused and contacted a supervisor. Radio transmissions indicate a change in procedural tone following the disclosure. The encounter concluded without citation, arrest, or further action. The officer documented the stop in an official incident report. The stop, the recorded exchange, and internal documentation became the central focus of review. The incident was examined by Internal Affairs legal counsel and subsequently drew public attention. The records of the stop, both visual and written, provide a complete account of actions taken before, during, and after the individual's identification as a judicial officer. This documentation establishes a sequence of events, the official responses, and the procedural record that frames the examination of authority, compliance, and administrative review in this case. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. I was told this channel wouldn't reach 1,000 subscribers, but stories like this deserve to be heard. Your support helps bring these cases to light and proves that these stories matter. On a weekday afternoon, a uniformed police officer initiated a stop involving a black adult male who was loading a stroller, child seat, and personal belongings into the trunk of a parked vehicle. A child was present at the location. The activity took place on a public residential street and was visible from the roadway. There was no reported crime, no suspect description, and no active call for service associated with the location or the individual. Despite this, the officer approached and engaged the individual, issuing commands before clearly stating a reason for the interaction. The encounter continued for several minutes and escalated procedurally through repeated questioning and requests for identification. During the interaction, the individual was later identified as a sitting family court judge with jurisdiction over child welfare and custody matters. The entire stop was captured on body-worn camera footage and later became public through media release and internal review processes. The incident provides a documented example of discretionary authority exercised during a routine police encounter without an identified legal trigger. It illustrates how decisions are made by officers in real time based on perception rather than verified information. The stop raises questions about how authority is asserted prior to establishing probable cause or reasonable suspicion. It further highlights how credibility and compliance are evaluated before identity, occupation, or legal status are known. The case also creates a measurable comparison point: how a civilian encounter proceeds when the individual is later revealed to hold institutional authority, and how that revelation alters procedural behavior. This allows for examination of how civilians without comparable status may experience similar encounters without the same outcome. At the center of the case is the balance between police discretion and civilian rights. The officer maintained control of the encounter through positioning, commands, and documentation authority, while the civilian remains subject to those decisions without a stated legal basis for detention. A second conflict exists between perception and reality. The officer categorized routine activity as suspicious without identifying a specific violation, while later acknowledging no offense occurred. A third conflict involves power and accountability. The officer exercised authority at the scene, while institutional accountability mechanisms were triggered only after the interaction became public. Finally, the case reflects the tension between institutional trust and public scrutiny once recorded evidence became available for external review. The case exposes how racialized decision-making can occur during low-level encounters that do not originate from criminal activity. It demonstrates how threat assessment may rely on subjective interpretation rather than observable conduct. Disparities in treatment become evident once the individual's professional status is disclosed, allowing comparison of procedural behavior before and after verification. The case also highlights structural mechanisms that prioritize internal review and administrative language over immediate accountability. The individual involved in the stop is a family court judge serving within the same jurisdiction as the responding police department. His professional background includes formal legal education, bar admission, and appointment to the bench following years of legal practice. His judicial responsibilities include overseeing family law cases involving custody, child welfare, parental rights, and protective services. He has no documented criminal history, no disciplinary record, and no prior incidents involving law enforcement misconduct. On the day of the incident, his activities align with routine parental responsibilities, including transporting a child and related equipment. There is no evidence indicating deviation from normal daily conduct. The encounter occurred in a residential neighborhood with parked vehicles, single-family homes, and standard pedestrian visibility. The time of day was early afternoon, with clear environmental conditions and no crowd presence. The location provided unobstructed visibility for both the officer and the individual. Surveillance potential included nearby residences and vehicle-mounted cameras. Prior to police arrival, the activity consisted solely of loading child-related items into a personal vehicle. No interactions with other civilians were recorded. The officer approached the individual and issued verbal instructions. Body-worn camera footage confirms the officer asked what the individual was doing. The individual responded that he was loading his vehicle. The officer requested identification without stating a specific offense or legal justification. The individual complied and did not attempt to leave or challenge the officer's authority. At this stage, the encounter could have concluded following verbal clarification. No additional investigative steps were required to confirm lawful activity. Despite the absence of observable wrongdoing, the officer maintained the interaction. Requests for identification were repeated, and the officer referenced suspicious behavior without elaboration. The officer positioned himself between the individual and the vehicle. The stroller remained partially secured, and the child remained present throughout the exchange. Internal justification for continuation was later documented in an incident report using generalized language rather than statutory references. The officer did not disengage voluntarily. Several minutes into the stop, the individual identified himself as a family court judge serving in the jurisdiction. The officer paused following this disclosure and contacted a supervisor. Radio communication logs indicated a change in procedural approach after the disclosure. The officer's language and posture shifted, and supervisory input was sought. No additional investigation was conducted after this point. The encounter concluded without citation, arrest, or further detention. The officer documented the interaction in an official report. Body-worn camera footage was retained per department policy. Dispatch logs confirmed no associated criminal activity. Internal review processes were later initiated following public release of the footage. The primary authority figure in this case is a uniformed patrol officer assigned to routine neighborhood patrol duties within the Atlanta Police Department. At the time of the incident, the officer held the rank of patrol officer and had approximately 6 years of active service. Department records indicate the officer had completed standard academy training, annual use of force certification, and ongoing field evaluations required for continued service. A review of publicly available records shows the officer had previously received routine commendations related to attendance and procedural compliance. There were no publicly disclosed sustained disciplinary actions on record at the time of the incident. However, internal complaint logs indicate prior civilian complaints related to discretionary stops. These complaints were reviewed individually and closed without formal discipline. The officer's discretionary authority included the ability to initiate consensual encounters, investigative detentions based on reasonable suspicion, and enforcement actions based on probable cause. Department policy allowed broad discretion in identifying and engaging suspicious behavior, provided articulable reasoning could later be documented. Decision-making autonomy during the encounter remained solely with the officer until a supervisor was contacted. No immediate oversight was present during the first phase of the interaction. The officer controlled the duration of the stop, the physical positioning of the parties, the scope of questioning, and the timing of escalation. The targeted individual was a sitting family court judge in Fulton County, Georgia. He held jurisdiction over child custody cases, dependency hearings, and matters involving child welfare services. His judicial authority extended over courtroom proceedings, legal determinations, and enforcement of court orders within his jurisdiction. The judge possessed formal legal education, courtroom experience, and direct familiarity with constitutional protections, search and seizure standards, and detention thresholds. His legal expertise exceeded that of the officer in matters of statutory interpretation and civil rights law. Despite this institutional authority, the judge lacked situational power during the encounter. He was not acting in a judicial capacity. He had no enforcement tools, no control over the scene, and no authority to terminate the stop. Compliance was required to avoid escalation. His professional status carried no functional weight until it was verbally disclosed and verified. Supervisory personnel entered the case after identity disclosure. Dispatch logs indicate that a supervising sergeant was contacted approximately 18 minutes into the encounter. The supervisor did not initially appear on scene, but provided direction via radio communication. Command decisions following involvement included reassessment of the stop's basis, guidance on documentation, and approval to conclude the encounter without further action. Supervisors control post-incident messaging, report review, and internal routing of the case for administrative assessment. The incident occurred in a residential area with moderate visibility. At least 2 bystanders were within visual range, including neighboring residents. None physically intervened. Their capacity for intervention was limited to observation and potential recording. No bystander statements were included in the initial incident report. Subsequent media coverage referenced the presence of witnesses, but did not cite sworn testimony or affidavits at the time of review. Department data shows the officer conducted a higher-than-average number of pedestrian and vehicle-based discretionary stops relative to peers assigned to the same patrol zone. These stops were predominantly non-criminal in outcome, resulting in warnings or no action. Internal analytics revealed a disproportionate number of stops involving Black individuals when compared to neighborhood demographics. Each stop was individually justified as situational, but no cumulative pattern review was conducted prior to this incident. Previous complaints related to similar encounters were handled as isolated events. Reviews focus on policy compliance rather than outcome disparity. No retraining or behavioral intervention was documented. Incident reports frequently use broad terminology such as suspicious behavior, area awareness, and officer safety concerns without detailed articulation. This language met minimum reporting standards but limited post-review clarity. No supervisory review process flagged the cumulative effect of discretionary stops. Early warning systems were not activated. The lack of aggregated analysis prevented proactive correction. The judge exits his residence carrying child-related items. No unusual behavior is observed. A stroller, diaper bag, and child seat are placed near the open trunk. The child remains nearby. The patrol vehicle slows. The officer observes from the street. No dispatch alerts are active. The officer exits the vehicle and issues verbal instructions before stating a reason for contact. The officer asks for identification without stating a specific violation. The officer references suspicious behavior. Physical positioning limits movement. The individual states he is a family court judge in Fulton County. A supervising sergeant is contacted. Radio tone and language change. The stop conclude without citation or arrest. Documentation is completed. The examination of this case relies on 3 primary categories of evidence: physical evidence documented at the scene, digital recordings generated during the encounter, and official records produced afterward. Each category contributes independently to reconstructing what occurred and verify how decisions were made. The vehicle was parked legally along a residential curb. Photographs and body camera footage confirmed the vehicle was stationary, engine off, and not obstructing traffic. The trunk was open throughout most of the encounter. No movement of the vehicle occurred during the interaction. There was no indication of tampering, forced entry, or unsafe placement. The officer positioned his patrol vehicle behind the parked car without activating emergency lights. This positioning effectively blocked the civilian's access to the driver's door while not constituting a formal traffic stop. Inside the trunk, a folded stroller, diaper bag, and child seat components were visible. The stroller was partially secured but not fully locked into place. These items remained in the same position for the duration of the stop, indicating the activity was interrupted. No prohibited items were visible. No search of the vehicle was conducted, and no items were removed or handled by law enforcement. Body-worn camera footage provides continuous visual and audio record from the officer's arrival through conclusion of the encounter. The footage confirms that the officer initiated contact without citing a specific offense. Commands were issued before the officer articulated a reason for engagement. The footage captures the officer's language, physical positioning, and pauses during the exchange. It also records a moment the civilian identified himself as a family court judge. After this disclosure, a noticeable procedural pause occurs, followed by radio communication with a supervisor. Dispatch records show no calls for service related to the individual, the vehicle, or the location at the time of the stop. No matching suspect description was active. The officer did not reference a dispatch alert as justification during the interaction. Radio transmissions confirm the officer contacted a supervisor after the civilian disclosed his judicial position. The timing of the call aligns with a shift in the officer's conduct. No backup was dispatched. No request for identification verification through dispatch was completed. The incident report was filed after the encounter. The report references suspicious behavior as the basis of stop, but does not specify a statutory violation. The report notes compliance by the civilian and states the encounter concluded without enforcement action. Internal departmental communications reviewed later addressed the public visibility of the incident rather than the legality of the initial stop. These memos focus on messaging, review procedures, and coordination with legal counsel. The police department issued an initial statement several days after the footage became public. The statement described the stop as a routine field interaction and emphasized that no arrest occurred. Subsequent statements clarified that an internal review was underway. Internal Affairs opened a review focusing on policy compliance. The scope of the review was limited to whether departmental procedures were followed, not whether the stop itself was constitutionally justified. Public statements characterized the encounter as brief and uneventful. Body camera footage and timestamps indicate the interaction lasted approximately 15 minutes. The department described the stop as proactive policing, while internal documents avoided defining the specific behavior that justified suspicion. The department did not initially address the civilian's judicial role. This information was acknowledged only after it became widely reported. Internal communications indicate concern over public perception rather than procedural failure. The officer remained on active duty during the review. No suspension or reassignment occurred. The department later stated that the officer received guidance but did not specify disciplinary action. The department announced a review of its stop and engage policies. No formal policy changes were published directly in response to this case. The civilian filed a civil claim citing unlawful detention and violation of constitutional rights. The case entered pretrial proceedings. No criminal charges were filed against the officer. The review did not address why identification was requested without stated cause. No explanation was provided for the escalation prior to identity disclosure. The role of implicit discretion remained unexamined. The case concludes where it began, with the initial command issued before reason was stated. That moment defines the trajectory of the encounter. The officer's perception of suspicious behavior was not supported by dispatch data, physical evidence, or statutory violation. Verified records show lawful activity interrupted by discretionary authority. The case demonstrates how institutional response prioritizes procedural defense over substantive review. The outcome was influenced not by new facts, but by the revelation of professional status. Would the encounter have ended differently without identity disclosure? What standards govern suspicion in non-traffic stops? How often are similar encounters undocumented or unresolved? Please subscribe to the channel and enable notifications so you don't miss future stories, updates, and in-depth discussions. Thank you for being part of this platform dedicated to examining the facts and pursuing accountability. Until next time, stay informed and stay safe.